Five, four, three, two, one.
All right, hello, willkommen, bienvenue, konnichiwa. It's time for the Armist Inquisition yet again, episode 181 on Sunday, the 25th of April. I'm Armish Phil.
I'm Armish Ben.
I'm Armish Matt.
And tonight we're going back to the Bronze Age again, and back to ancient Egypt, because we've got senior lecturer in Egyptology at Liverpool University, Roland Enmarch. How are you doing, Roland?
Very well, thank you. And you, I hope you're all well too.
Did I say your surname? What's the pronunciation of your surname?
The surname is Enmarch.
Enmarch, rather than Enmarch. I give it a bit of a French twang there.
Nobody ever gets it right. Don't worry, it's my ancestors' fault for spelling it weirdly.
That's okay. We were just having a bit of a convo about what we would like to talk about regarding ancient Egypt. We've talked about the subject in different episodes in the past. I mean, one thing I would like to start off with was maybe more generally, what is it about ancient Egypt that captures the imagination of the public and it keeps drawing people back over centuries?
Well, I think for the general public, it goes back to gold, everywhere the glint of gold. It's Tutankhamun and the flickering candles, seeing all of the gold furniture in the tomb in 1922. I think, yeah, it's gold, it's giant whopping great buildings, the pyramids, and it's femme fatale like Cleopatra. I think, you know, I don't wish to be dismissive, but I think that probably in terms of the Western world, in terms of the popular perception, I think if you had to list the most important things, people probably would say Tutankhamun, pyramids, Cleopatra.
Yeah, and I guess one sort of aspect is just the sheer antiquity of it all, because this is one of, you know, the founding civilizations that we're aware of. But again, there's not sort of this obsession with ancient Akkad or Babylon or these other, you know, sort of parallel civilizations that we're running, is there?
No, that's right. I mean, Egypt is one of the four primary civilizations of the old world. So when we say that, we mean civilizations that arose out of nothing. A secondary civilization is one that was influenced by a primary civilization to start with. And in the whole of the old world, there are currently thought to only be four: Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley in Pakistan, and in China as well. So, in that sense, Egypt is one of the very earliest and one of these four primary civilizations. People debate whether actually Egypt and Mesopotamia were linked in some way rather than being completely separate, and I think there is some evidence that that's the case. As to why Egypt is better known than Mesopotamia, there's a whole load of different reasons for that. For a start, you can't go on holiday to Mesopotamia, and you haven't been able to since the beginning of the 21st century. Iraq is not exactly a hot tourist destination, which is unfortunate because one can actually visit bits of it if you're intrepid, but you know, it's not a mass tourist destination like Egypt. The other problem is that Mesopotamia has no stone resources native to it. Mesopotamia is a giant floodplain. And so all they have is mud and clay and silt. And their entire civilization is basically built out of that. So they build, using mud bricks. They write on clay tablets. And actually, it's relatively rare to have stone objects, let alone whole buildings made out of stone in Mesopotamia. So for that reason, it's somewhat less impressive to the eye, even if you can get to Iraq, when you go and see these things. Whereas when you go to Egypt, you can see a whopping great pyramid just on the edge of Cairo, or three of them, in fact, and that's damned impressive. Oh, please excuse my profanity.
Don't worry about that. There's no shortage of profanity on this show. We try and be civilised, but,
yeah,
We are filthy Scythians, pretty much. You've got a particular interest in ancient Egyptian language and literature and whatnot. Now, when most people think of ancient language, they think hieroglyphs. So you'd like have hieroglyphs on the temples, which is obviously like a religious usage. People who've listened to our podcast a lot will be familiar with the Amarna letters, which were more like a diplomatic use of language between Pharaoh and various nearby rulers. But when you say literature, you think more of writing as a form of expression. Is this something that we have examples of from the ancient Egyptian world?
Yes, we do, and this is what I'm interested in. You're right. Everyone knows the Egyptians had writing, and they know that hieroglyphs are Egyptian writing, but we don't tend to talk enough about what they wrote down in hieroglyphs. So, you've got two things. You've got the script that you write in, and you've got the language that you write in as well. In English and in French and in German, we use essentially the same script, the 26-letter alphabet, which, with minor variations, is essentially the same amongst, Western European languages. So hieroglyphs are a script, and they're one of three scripts that the Egyptians used over the course of their civilization. Hieroglyph, the actual term is a Greek one. It means a sacred carving. And it was given to that script by the Greeks towards the end of Egyptian civilization. And hieroglyphs were always monumental in nature. They were usually carved, often very minutely decorated, but they were for sacred purposes. So you tend to find them in temples, in people's tombs, in particularly sacred parts of the world where you want everyone to know that there's something sacred going on. The Egyptians, when they were writing their, day-to-day business accounts, of course, they wouldn't have carved them on wood or stone. That wouldn't have been practical. So that's when they used papyrus. And on papyrus, they used a reed pen, basically a reed that you pluck out of the marsh, chew the end of it, swizzle it around in a cake of black carbon, from lamp black or something like that, and then you, with water, and then you write away. And if you write with a brush, it's like painting. It's not like using a biro where you press. It's more like painting on papyrus, and it changes the shape of signs, and it favors a more cursive look. And that script, which the Egyptians originally developed for everyday writing purposes, letters, accounts, other kinds of records, was known by the Greeks as hieratic. And in Greek, hieratic means priestly, which is a bit of a misleading term because it's true that by the time the Greeks were writing, hieratic had become restricted to being a priestly script. But originally it was used for everything that hieroglyphs weren't written, that didn't get written in hieroglyphs. And finally, towards the end of Egyptian civilization, they had a third, even more short script called Demotic by the Greeks, popular. And that is basically an even quicker, more cursive way of writing with a pen and ink on papyrus. Now, that's the script. Then you have the language that the script writes, and the ancient Egyptian language is it's either the oldest or the second oldest language whose writing exists in the world. Of course, we assume that language was invented long before writing was, but basically Sumerian in Mesopotamia and ancient Egyptian in Egypt are the world's two oldest written down languages. And the ancient Egyptian language evolved over the thousands of years of Egyptian civilization in the same way that if you study English literature, you read about, Old English, Middle English, Modern English, you find similar patterns in Egyptian. And the very oldest Egyptian texts date to around about 3200 BC. And that language continued. And actually, it survived the death of pharaonic civilization. So after paganism came to an end, when Egypt converted for several hundred years into being a majority Christian country, the hieroglyphic script died out. It was no longer used. And indeed, all these other scripts died out as well. But what happened was that people carried on speaking what was by then the current form of the Egyptian language, but they wrote it down in Greek letters. And that last form of the language is called Coptic. And it probably didn't go out of everyday use until about the 14th century AD. And to this day, it is still used by the Coptic Christian Church in Egypt as their sacred language in their church rituals. So in that sense, ancient Egyptian has a written attestation of at least 4,500 years as a living language, maybe 5,000 years if you consider its ongoing use as a religious liturgical language today.
Wow.
Am I being a bit long-winded here?
No, not at all, no.
Perfect.
No. You mentioned the three types of scripts, hieroglyphs, hieratics, and
Demotic.
Demotic. Now, were these all three used in parallel throughout ancient Egypt, or was it an evolution from one into the other?
Hieroglyphs are used from the very beginning to the very end of pagan Egyptian civilization. The hieratic cursive form is pretty much as old as hieroglyphs, and it only dies out in the early centuries AD. So it also, for most of the time, hieroglyphs and hieratic existed in parallel for different sorts of writing. Sacred, monumental sacred texts, hieroglyphs, anything written on papyrus, hieratic, very broadly. Demotic is a latecomer. It emerges around about 650 BC, which is, by Egyptian standards, quite late. And it's an even quicker version of the script, and it rapidly replaces hieratic for everyday purposes, like writing letters, keeping business accounts, and things like that. You asked me about the literature of ancient Egypt, and of course, it's one thing to say the script and the language, but then what texts did people write down? And the thing I study particularly are the poems that the ancient Egyptians wrote down. And we have a huge flowering of poetry and of storytelling in Egyptian culture around about the turn of the 3rd and 2nd millennia. So around about 2000 BC, and for a few centuries after it, we have a big burst of poems. Some of them are relatively long. I mean, when I say a poem, I mean it could be several hundred lines of verse long. And some of these are stories. A happened, then B happened, then C happened. Then classic narrative. Some of them are wisdom texts, so they're about how to live a good life. And some of them are debates between people who take different points of view about some of the core questions of what it is to be alive. So,
wow, like Plato dialogue sort of stuff.
Yeah, exactly. So one of these, for example, is called by modern Egyptologists the dialogue of a man with his soul, in which a man has an argument with his soul. And the man says, life is terrible. It'll be so much better when I'm in the next world, because then I'll be in the presence of the gods. It'll all be hunky-dory. And his soul says to him, you don't know there's an afterlife. The people who built great big tombs for themselves are no better off than those who have been washed up, drowned, dead on the seashore, rotting away in the sun, nibbled by the fish, with no one to mourn for them. Once you are dead, you will not come up again to see the sunlight. I think probably in terms of how people think about Egypt, we usually think that the Egyptians had a really positive view of the next world, the afterlife. And by and large, that's true. But of course, all faith is inextricably linked on the other side to doubt and skepticism. And so there's this consistent minor undertone in Egyptian culture of doubt, fear, and skepticism. And this dialogue basically puts these 2 points of view, and it goes into the ins and outs of it. And as you said, it's not exactly like Platonic dialogue. Platonic dialogue takes points in a relatively logical kind of way. It's more artful and more emotional than that. Yeah. But fundamentally, it does the same thing. It puts different points of views and lets them be, worked through so people can gain a fuller understanding of the topic.
Sort of like an early artistic philosophy, then?
It's the Egyptian equivalent. I mean, philosophy was invented by the Greeks, but it doesn't mean that other cultures didn't think about the important matters of life. Where do we come from? Why are we here? Where do we go? These are not just the Greeks' problems. They're all humans have to face those kind of questions and come up with them. And these kinds of texts address those problems as well. For example, there's another dialogue which is actually about why does evil exist in the world? Is it the king's fault, or is it his subjects' fault, or is it the god's fault? So, again, you can sort of see these fundamental questions. Why does evil exist? Is there an afterlife? They're ones that we still grapple with in our own everyday lives, and nothing has changed in the last 4,000 years in that respect.
Do we know anything about the authors of these texts? Did they used to sign the work like an author would today?
No, the Egyptians didn't have the concept of authorship in quite the same way. Western European culture is pretty obsessed with authorship. Yeah. Not all cultures are. And so most of the texts that survive, literary and other sorts as well, are anonymous in the sense that we do not know who composed them. Yeah. Usually the Egyptians talk about these texts and they name them after the characters in them, not by who wrote them. Which is interesting, and it's a bit unclear whether the Egyptians actually thought that the protagonists, the actual characters, were people who had actually written the text. I think probably they knew on some level that this wasn't true. There's a very, very dramatic text called The Teaching of King Amenemhat, and it's almost like that bit in Hamlet when his dead father's ghost appears to him and tells him he was murdered. And this is exactly what Amenemhat does. He's been murdered, and he appears to his son Senwosret, and he describes his assassination very dramatically. And he says, my subjects were so ungrateful, I did nothing to deserve this. It's pretty dramatic stuff. It's quite gripping, really.
Yeah, it sounds it. I mean, do any of these texts sort of allude to like foundational cultural myths of ancient Egypt in the same way as Homeric stories, and we've got the same from India and the Vedas and whatnot?
That's a difficult question. Each culture is unique to itself, and so it's a bit difficult to just make direct comparisons like that. But yes, many of these works of literature at least play with these core ideas. So, for example, the teaching of King Amenemhat, by the way, the fact that he speaks as a ghost, it's interesting that text the Egyptians did ascribe to a named author who was not the dead king. So it kind of, on some level, they were clearly aware of the fictitious nature of it. Sorry, I've lost my train of thought.
I'm just thinking of like the sort of foundation myth and theology of Horus and Isis and the slaying of Set, the chopping up of Osiris's body, and Isis. Yeah. Putting it back together and then shagging his dead carcass and giving birth to Horus and all. Is all this sort of talked about in the poetry?
So the poetry is probably for entertainment. So it's not the most serious use of writing. We're not talking about scripture. The Egyptians didn't have a set, fixed canon of texts, like, for example, Judaism, Christianity, or Islam do, which they consider to be their holy books. That doesn't mean the Egyptians didn't have sacred writings. They, in fact, had tons of them, but they didn't have a single authoritative collection. And most of their texts that were sacred were for ritual purposes. And you don't find them in literature. Literature is for entertainment. Right. And so the literary texts do play with the core cultural ideas, but they often riff on them, or they sometimes ask difficult questions that would be quite threatening if you actually asked them in a religious context. But at a party, when you're listening to a story, you can say, what if there's no afterlife? The Greek writer Herodotus tells us, he visited Egypt in the 400s BC, and he tells us that at Egyptian banquets, in the middle of the banquet, they start playing a particular song, and they'd bring out a wooden figure of a mummy and show it to all the guests who are having the party, so that they would be reminded that they had to eat, drink, and be merry, because it wouldn't last forever. So the Egyptians actually quite enjoyed exploring these what seemed to us to be quite dark thoughts, but they do it in this kind of socially acceptable context. It's a bit like, why do we like tragedy? I mean, tragedy is really depressing. And all the Shakespeare characters end up dying and gaining heroic self-knowledge just before they're splattered. You might think that's a bit depressing. Or why do people watch disaster movies? Human beings like to consider the untoward, the disastrous, the difficult. We get something out of it. And I think the Egyptians were just like us in that respect.
Do you think, was there like a performative element to a lot of this stuff then? Was there like an equivalent to how plays were played out in Greece and whatnot?
So for the Egyptians, the word to read is the same as the word to recite. So reading aloud is very much the normal way that you do something. And quite a lot of these fictional stories are set at the court of the king, and somebody comes and tells him a story. And we assume that these fictional settings that are like frames for the ancient stories must presumably have had some correlate in reality. And so for that reason, we assume that performance of literature was key to it. I mean, only about 1% of the Egyptian population was literate. And so, for these things to have had much traction beyond a very narrow male elite, they must have been performed more widely. And many of these texts we know were read for hundreds of years. We find quotes of them and people criticizing each other for not knowing what the next verse is and things like that.
One thing I wanted to ask you about, I'm particularly interested in esoteric subjects. And when you start researching esoteric, symbolism is very important. You know how they say a picture paints 1,000 words and that. And just thinking back to hieroglyphs, it seems that these other scripts were adopted maybe through convenience or for expedience. Do you think maybe there's something missing in that, and that we maybe have lost some the fact that the hieroglyphs are pictorial and that, through symbolism they can convey multiple layers of meaning? Do you think maybe we're missing some of that?
I think you're absolutely right that the more cursive scripts written on papyrus with ink are not as pictorial. So they are more abstract squiggles, unlike hieroglyphs. With hieroglyphs, because they never lose their pictorial quality, which is unusual in the history of writing, most cultures move away from picture writing and develop more abstract writing forms. But for Egypt, because their writing signs were also pictures, the boundary between art and writing is actually considerably more porous than it would be in other cultures. And very often you can actually see tomb wall paintings, which are pictures of things the Egyptians like to do, like going hunting in the marshes, but you can also read them as a sentence if you know what the Egyptians are doing. So they play all sorts of complicated games, which it takes quite a lot of unpacking to do. But it's a bit like in China, of course, Chinese civilization, although its writing is not pictorial anymore, it is ideographic partly. So it's not just an alphabet. It has signs that convey meaning as well as pronunciation. And because of that, Chinese characters can still have an incredibly dense set of powerful religious meanings within Chinese traditional civilization. And I think it's very like that for the Egyptians, and some Egyptian symbols are so powerful they survive the death of Egyptian culture, the ancient Egyptian culture itself, like the Ankh, for example.
Yeah, that's something I'd like to ask you about, the Ankh, because, I mean, most people seeing that, see the cross and they'll think of Christianity. I mean, what do we have a decent handle? Is it the handle of the Ankh? Do we have a decent handle on what the Ankh actually meant, what it represented?
So the British Egyptologist Sir Alan Gardner, in his list of hieroglyphs, and this is our kind of industry standard, he reckoned that what the actual picture of an Ankh is the strap parts of a sandal. If you imagine a simple sandal and you take the sole away, you have the sort of bit that goes between your big toe and the other toes, the loop that goes around your actual ankle, and then a couple of side bits to attach to the sole. And so he reckons that the Ankh sign was in origin the sandal straps. And I think he might be right. It's a bit difficult to tell with some of these things because they're so ancient, they get lost in the mists of time at the very beginning of writing itself. But the reason that would have become important as a sign is not because it's a picture of a sandal strap. It's because the word sandal strap in Egyptian sounds the same as the word life. And hieroglyphs, the way that when they invented writing, they began by writing pictures of the words they were saying. But of course, a lot of words it's difficult to give a picture for. If you have the word history, for example. That's an abstract idea. It's very difficult to give you a concrete picture. So the way they started writing words that were abstract or difficult to show in a single physical image is they would start using puns. So because in Egyptian, sandal strap sounds very similar to the word life, you could write the word life with a sandal strap. And the reason Ankh becomes such an important symbol is because, well, the Egyptian world was all about attaining a good life, both here on Earth and, even more importantly, overcoming death and living for eternity in the next life. And so all over Egyptian art, you see the sign Ankh. The gods, if you look in Egyptian temples, the gods are usually shown holding the Ankh in their hands, meaning that the gods bestow life. Sometimes they're even shown holding up life sign to the nostrils of the reigning pharaoh, who is said to be given life by the gods. So this idea that, they could use this sandal strap, which is actually a hieroglyph meaning life, and they could be shown in art with the gods actually handing it to the king's nose. It's a very good example of how, that's a really blurry distinction between writing. It is a sign that only makes sense in the written system, but it's being used as iconography. And the Egyptians were past masters at this kind of stuff. I mean, the Egyptians loved esoterica. They loved playing games with these kinds of things.
Yeah, a lot of esoteric researchers believe that that's where it all came from, where it all started, was ancient Egypt, and it's been transmitted one way or another, from that time period through to today.
Well, I mean, I think the desire to discover what is secret was not unique to the Egyptians. I think all over the world you see people wanting to find out about mysteries. I don't think it's just the Egyptians who came up with that idea.
No, I mean, I guess because they're our earliest civilization, it's our earliest sort of chance to find evidence for it. I presume that it's gone on since people have been alive, but we just don't have the evidence for it.
That's it. I mean, because we have a lot of early religious material from Egypt, from even before the literature that we were talking about. So some of the oldest really large body of religious texts anywhere in the world is the Egyptian pyramid texts, which begin to be written on the subterranean the subterranean rooms of kings' pyramids from about the 24th century BC onwards. And these are ritual texts. So they were rituals that were performed during the funeral of the king and after his death to feed him when he needed feeding after he was dead. And some of the texts are also about his resurrection to an empowered place in the afterlife. And there's a lot of esoterica in that. Most Egyptians would not have had privy access to this information. The Egyptians did not believe that, lay people should know about these things. They are mysteries, and the priests are guarded. They are told not to reveal what they see in the sacred precincts.
Yeah, this is something that's interesting, the sort of priestly class in ancient Egypt. Was this something that was passed down from father to son? Was it something you could attain via aptitude? And just what was like the social standing? How did they compare in the scheme of ancient Egyptian society?
So I think the first thing to say is that not until a relatively late period were priests a discrete group in society as opposed to other kinds of wealthy people. For most of the first 1,500 years of Egyptian history, priestly activity was one of a portfolio of things you would do if you were a rich Egyptian member of the elite, along with other kinds of things, administrative responsibilities, military responsibilities. So people would have long strings of titles, some of which would be religious, but not all. And actually, quite a lot of the religious activity would be timeshare. You'd only be a part-time priest. So we know that what would often happen is that there would be a group of, a rota of 5 groups of priests, or later on, they whittled it down to 4, who would go in monthly rotas. And so they'd each serve a month in the cult, and then they'd be off for the next 3 or 4 months. So, this of course had a number of benefits. It meant that the wealth, the income that came from working as a priest, because it was quite a lucrative position, could be spread out amongst the elite. But it also means that people who were priests were by and large not just priests. They were also other things as well. And that begins to change from about 1500 BC onwards. Some of the very biggest priesthoods do seem to have developed rather large permanent staff. And this continues, this acceleration continues in the last 1,000 years before the birth of Christ as well. So by the last few centuries BC, priests had very much become a discrete group in society, but that was a late development compared to what had been the case earlier.
And was there like specializations within the priesthood? Would there be like the group of priests for Thoth and a group of priests for Isis and different sort of cults within, you know, sort of sectarian cults within the overall theology?
Yes, there would definitely have been different. The cults were all based in temples. So there would be priesthoods in particular temples worshipping particular gods. That's certainly the case. Whether they were sectarian in the kind of modern sense of, you know, not agreeing with each other, there's remarkably little evidence for that kind of thing in Egyptian thought. The Egyptians were actually quite happy to just mix everything together and assume that even if, you know, there were different accounts of how the world began, they all told some underlying story that was beyond direct human comprehension. And so the Egyptians seem to have had quite a subtle understanding of the fundamentally metaphorical nature of many of their myths, and it doesn't seem to have troubled them, therefore, that there are these variations in particular tellings of these stories from one temple to another. But in any given temple, there would be many different types of priests as well. So the most senior priests were usually known as Hemnecher, servant of God, of which there could be more than one head of the temple. But more modest priests, who were just like the ordinary skivvies, were called Wab, literally pure ones. And there were a range of other kinds of more specific priestly titles. Some of them were probably not permanent priestly titles, but particular ritual roles that people took on and performed in particular parts of the temple rituals. Some Egyptian rituals happened on a daily basis, and of course some were more festival-based and more periodic. And so there's a wide range of different kinds of titles you can have that are connected to priestly activities of different sorts.
I mean, I presume education was probably the biggest barrier for someone to get into the priesthood. And you mentioned that it was profitable to be in the priesthood. How did they sort of raise? Was it through taxation or something, or wanting what would you call it, sacrificial donations, or what? How did that work? How did they make money out of it?
So temples in ancient Egypt, just like, say, cathedrals in medieval Europe, had vast holdings of land and other kinds of wealth. We actually have some ancient Egyptian equivalents of the Doomsday Book. You know, we actually have land registers which show that the largest temples in Egypt had many tens of thousands of acres of land each, as well as, you know, fleets of ships, orchards, and things like that. So any large organization like that is going to produce a lot of surplus. And who is going to use up that surplus? Not all of it gets offered as food to the god on his altar. There's only so much you can cram onto the altar. And what really happens is, remember that Egypt didn't have coinage until quite late. So for most of Egyptian history, it's a non-monetary economy. That doesn't mean that they didn't have a value system and a way of exchanging goods based on their rateable value. They exactly what they did. But it meant that your pay was in kind. And so if you were a priest, you would have a right to a share of the temple income. And the Egyptians were actually quite advanced about this. So, for example, you could sell your right to the share of the temple income to someone else. And we actually have accounts of Egyptians doing this. And they because they want the benefits in perpetuity, they actually record these legal contracts on the walls of their tombs so that their descendants can go back and point to them and say, look, this really happened. But just to go back, you asked me earlier about, you know, were priests hereditary? And all Egyptians wanted ideally to hand on their jobs to their children. That's not just priests, but everybody wanted to do that. And, you know, the priests very often did do this. And towards the end of Egyptian society, they'd got much more successful at keeping it a closed shop. But that was, again, a late development of the first millennium BC. There's always this tension in Egypt between the idea of the father handing on his office to his son and the prerogative of Pharaoh to appoint people who are good and promote their careers. And if you look at the biographies that Egyptians write in their tombs, their autobiographies, some of them stress their ancestral descent and how they come from ancient and noble families. And some of them stress that the king promoted them because they were clever or useful. And so there's clearly a kind of tension at the heart of Egyptian society between those mechanisms of advancement.
The tension between meritocracy and nepotism.
Exactly.
Some things never change, do they?
No, well, I've been studying Egypt now since I was, 13, I think. Began learning hieroglyphs at the age of 13. So, almost 30 years. And the more I know about Egypt, and I do keep finding out new things all the time, the more convinced I am that human nature really doesn't change.
No. One thing that interests me about Egyptian theology is this interest with Sirius in particular and the Sothic cycle, the Sothic calendar. Can you maybe tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so the star Sirius, which of course is after the planets and the sun and the moon, it's the brightest body in the sky, was extremely important for the Egyptians. The Egyptian New Year, in theory, was supposed to begin when Sirius could be sighted for the first time just before the sun rose. Sirius is not always visible before dawn. For parts of the year, the sun rises before you see Sirius. And when on the first day you could see star Sirius on the horizon just before the sun came up, that was taken to mark their new year. And it usually happened in the middle of summer, middle of August, or middle of July, something of that sort. And it was a very big religious festival. The Egyptian priests were quite good star watchers. They sat on the temple roofs and they watched the motions of the heavens. And actually, that's how they timed their rituals at night. They had star clocks. So you would have a couple of priests sitting facing each other, and one priest would look at the priest opposite him, and he'd look at the stars behind him in the night sky, and he'd be able to work out, at a certain hour of the night, on this day of the year, the culmination of this star marks the 6th hour of the night, and that's when we need to perform this ritual. So actually, for the Egyptians, star clocks are incredibly important, but Sirius is even more important because it marks the start of the new year. In religious terms, the name for Sirius in Egyptian is Sepdet, or Sopdet, and she was a goddess, and she's often likened to the goddess Isis. And the goddess Isis was married to the god Osiris, and Osiris was killed and resurrected by Isis. And so the Egyptians thought that Orion and Sirius were Osiris and Isis, with Isis travelling after Osiris in the sky. It's a little bit more complex than that. I've simplified because when I say Orion, the stars the Egyptians thought made up Orion aren't quite the ones that we had, but the general idea, you get the idea.
Yeah, and the dog star, that's what they call it, isn't it? I mean, I would have thought that maybe it was related to Anubis, with it being called the dog star, but that's obviously a modern sort of meaning.
I think, no, the Romans used this term, didn't they? Because it's Canis,
Canis Major.
Canis Major, yeah. And I know that in the Roman world, they called the hot days of summer the dog days of summer, and it was believed that Sirius's heat contributed to the heat of a Roman August. So definitely the Romans used dog, but I'm not aware of the Egyptians doing so. I mean, the Isis and Anubis do occasionally interact in Egyptian mythology, so I wouldn't hand on heart say somewhere in 3,000 years of pagan writing you couldn't find a single reference to Sirius and Anubis being linked, but it's not a major theme in Egyptian.
One of the common themes with ancient civilizations and their priesthood does seem to be that one of the major functions of the priesthood is astronomy. I mean, this has got to be tied to agriculture, I guess, is it?
Well, it's partly agriculture, yes. I mean, the the rising of the star Sirius just before the sun, what's called the Helical Rising, as well as marking the new year, it also usually coincides with when the Nile begins to flood. So the Nile every year, at least until the building of the dams in the 20th century, the Nile every year would flood in summer, and it would bring down the silt from the Ethiopian highlands, and it would, when it receded, people would have, plant their crops. And this is a key event in the Egyptian agricultural calendar. And so, rather than just being a ritual thing, presumably it was the agricultural significance that made it an important temple ritual rather than the other way round.
Yeah, well, being able to predict the flooding of the Nile and seasonality of your surroundings is crucial, isn't it? Once you start to become a settled civilization and putting roots down and building structures, if you are able to demonstrate your aptitude at predicting these things, you're going to go far, my son, aren't you?
Absolutely. The Egyptians, like all of us, hated uncertainty. They lived in a world where lots of very bad things could happen and where things could go wrong. And, as do we. And none of us like to think that that's really what happens. And so, like all of us, the Egyptians scrambled for some sense of security, the idea that rituals would give them security, the idea that magic could protect them, the idea that knowing the courses of the objects in the heavens could actually influence life down here on Earth. And, the ongoing popularity of astrology in today's newspapers and online suggests that we haven't really moved that far along since.
Some would say it's become rather less sophisticated, maybe, over the last few thousand years. But
it's true that, if you look at ancient Egyptian horoscopes, they are pretty complicated. But yeah, I'm sure that, as with all these things, you can do it in a more intellectual or a less intellectual kind of way. For everyone who just looks at what Mystic Meg or whatever says is going to happen to them, then there might well be people who do spend a lot of time studying the tarot and knowing its esoteric significance very deeply. And of course, there may be non-believers who study it academically as well.
Yeah. You mentioned I mentioned I was just thinking, the sort of one of the chief reasons for the priesthood, the sort of chief functions being astronomy. Did they have like an equivalent of augury like the Romans and the Greeks had of reading entrails and flights of birds and all that sort of thing? Did the priesthood do that sort of thing?
The Egyptians did have a number of similar sorts of ways of trying to tell the will of the gods in the future. So I must admit, I can't think of specifically looking at birds, but they did, for example, look at scarab beetles and their movements and the way they moved. And it's the same principle, just with a different animal. Considerably less of a pain than trying to find eagles, I suppose. But they had lots of other ways of trying to tell the future as well. So they had dream interpretation manuals, for example. They also had calendars of lucky and unlucky days with explanations as to what you should or shouldn't do on particular days of the year. They also conducted other kinds of divination to tell the future. So, for example, there's one particular kind of ritual where you have a cup of water and you drop a drop of oil onto the top of the water, and the patterns it makes as it spreads out, you then read as if you're doing, a bit like tea leaves in the modern world or something like that. The Egyptians also listened to natural omens. So there's one interesting text which talks about thunder omens and what happens if you hear thunder, which is a relatively rare event in Egypt, but it does happen. There are also other weird and wonderful texts about this. There's one text from quite late on, which is called the Book of the Gecko. And if you live in an Egyptian mud brick house, quite often there are lots of creepy crawlies living with you in the walls. And so something that would happen not entirely infrequently would be a little gecko would drop off the ceiling onto you. And depending on what part of your body the lizard hit, you can interpret its meaning. So, if the gecko drops on a woman's left breast, bad, it means that she'll lose her husband, and so on and so forth. So, the Egyptians had tons and tons and tons of this material. And a lot of it's never really been fully published. Some of it's just only now coming to light.
It must have freaked them out when unusual things happened in the heavens. Thinking like of eclipses or comets and things like that. I mean, is there any sort of evidence of them tracking comets or predicting comets or anything like that?
So the problem with trying to spot these things in the texts is looking at the words people are using and what they're saying about. There is no separate word we can say means comet in Egyptian. There are references to stars falling, but is that a meteorite? Is it some other kind of... There are a number of possible things you might describe as a star falling. So we're a bit hampered by the vagaries of the terminology, but certainly unusual events were given significance. So it's quite likely that at least one of the sacred objects that was worshipped in one Egyptian temple was a meteorite.
Wow.
Because it fell from heaven. It was the symbol of the sun god. And in fact, you know the obelisk, the kind of tall, pointy thing, that is probably meant to recreate in stone the Ben object in Heliopolis, which was the central temple of the sun god. And although that object doesn't survive, it has been suggested that might have been a meteorite, for example. But in terms of eclipses, we do have references to eclipses in Egyptian texts. They're not actually nearly as common as you might imagine over the thousands of years that the Egyptian world existed, but they do occasionally crop up. And we can infer from the way they talk about them that a solar eclipse was considered to be a rather bad thing.
It's like the death of the sun god, isn't it?
Well, yeah, exactly. It ain't good. There's one wonderful text where a king sort of says, a civil war broke out in this year, even though there hadn't been a solar eclipse. So that kind of shows you kind of what's, by implication they associated would have happened with solar eclipses. And, almost any other kind of unusual phenomenon that you can see in the sky probably would have been important to the Egyptians, yeah.
Yeah, you would have to think so, because of just the amount of time they spend looking up, they don't have the modern distractions that we have. There was no light pollution, for 10 hours of the day, lots of them will have been staring at the sky and wondering what it's all about. And you would imagine anything out of they would get to know the night sky 100 times better than any of us alive today could possibly, try and replicate. And you would think that they would be able to spot more discrete changes maybe than we can before the advent of modern, technology and astronomy.
I think that it's probably true that they had the ability to do that. There's a big difference between ancient Egypt and ancient Mesopotamia. In ancient Mesopotamia, we have many, many more written sources surviving because they wrote on clay, which is more durable than papyrus. Yeah. And so what we really lack are the temple archives where they may have kept records of this sort. We know that in Mesopotamia, this is precisely the sort of thing that Mesopotamian astronomers did actually do. I'd be surprised if the ancient Egyptians didn't, but because of the really quite poor survival of papyrus sources from Egypt, it's simply the case that we can't demonstrate that for sure until a much later date, the last few centuries BC, I'm afraid.
It makes you wonder what was in the Library of Alexandria, doesn't it?
Oh, yes. That was yes. I mean, we can speculate till the cows come home about that. I mean, by the time the library in Alexandria was created in the 3rd century BC, Egyptian star knowledge had fused with Mesopotamian star knowledge, and those had both then fused again with Greek star knowledge. So basically, the whole East Mediterranean went, in terms of their astronomical knowledge, went into a big blender in the last few centuries. And that is what then went on into medieval Christian and Islamic star knowledge as well.
Was it Ptolemy who built the library?
So the library probably was built in the reign of Ptolemy II or Ptolemy III. There's some debate about this, and so I'm not going to nail my colours to the mast, but let's say the 200s BC.
Yeah, so I mean, was that sort of an attempt to collate all the knowledge that they had and bring it all into one place where people could come and study? Presumably all these texts were scattered across in various temples across the country beforehand. Is that the general idea?
Well, there's a slightly thorny problem here, because we're not even sure whether the library in Alexandria dealt with anything in the native Egyptian language. Certainly, the aim was to collect everything that had ever been written in Greek. and store that. But it's much less clear whether the library also catered to being a repository for the traditional knowledge of pharaonic Egyptian civilization in the Egyptian language. And it's difficult to know. I mean, there would have been plenty of temple libraries all over the country that they could have drawn on if they wanted to do that. It's just not clear whether the Greek-speaking rulers of Alexandria cared that much.
So do you think the Hellenization of Egypt from the Ptolemies on was quite brutal then, as far as is concerned with the pre-Ptolemaic Egyptian culture?
Well, I think that's a difficult one to answer. I mean, from the time of Alexander the Great's conquest in 332 BC, for about 1,000 years after that, Greek language was dominant in Egypt in terms of the very top layers of the administration. This includes through the Ptolemies. Even under the Roman Empire, Greek remained basically the administrative language of Egypt. So you've got to imagine after Alexander the Great's conquest that, if you want to get on at the very top level of government in Egypt, you probably have to learn Greek if you're an Egyptian. We know that this is exactly the sort of thing that happened. We have plenty of Egyptians who learned Greek and who functioned under the Ptolemies. We also have plenty of Greeks who learned Egyptian, so they could do. So there's a lot of interaction there. Right. And actually, under the Ptolemies, if you wanted to go to the law, you could do so in Greek or you could do so in Egyptian, and there were actually different legal processes depending on which language you did. So the Ptolemies were quite respectful of indigenous traditions. They had kind of parallel traditions to their Greek subjects. And the Ptolemies sometimes present themselves as Greek rulers, presumably for a Greek audience. And sometimes they show themselves as traditional pharaonic rulers with the headdress and all of that. So there's a delicate balancing act in how they present themselves in Egypt. All this changes after the last Ptolemaic ruler, Cleopatra, the Cleopatra. Once the Romans conquer Egypt, they can't be bothered mucking around with these weird indigenous languages and scripts anymore. And Greek becomes much more the only language of anything administrative. And so after the Roman conquest, the native writing carries on, but it becomes more and more restricted to native elites working in temples. So that after about maybe 200 AD, the total number of people who could probably read the indigenous Egyptian writing was probably quite small. And there was, it's not until the 4th century AD that they start writing Egyptian in Greek letters, and that's because the indigenous scripts are dying out with paganism.
Wow. Yeah, it's the ruthless efficiency, I guess, of the Romans, isn't it?
That's it, yes. I mean, they could just about be bothered to learn Greek because they had a huge chip on their shoulder about the Greeks being more civilized than them. But learning Egyptian was a step too far. Yeah,
it's play by our rules, and, we'll have a garrison here and a garrison there, and we'll have our man come and administrate everything as well. And just keep your nose clean, pay your taxes, and we'll leave you alone.
That's the theory. Rome and Egypt had quite a fractious relationship because, Egypt was where they got the grain ships that fed the Roman plebs, the
Dole. The Dole, yeah.
Yeah. So if the Egyptians got a bit uppity and, there was a rebellion and you didn't, stop sending the corn ships, that could be mucho problemo for a Roman emperor. And in fact, the Egyptian province had a special status in the Roman Empire. It was a personal possession of the emperor.
Yes.
And that probably reflects its importance as a breadbasket.
Yeah, the breadbasket of Rome. And gold played a huge role. I remember when I was reading Eric Klein's book, and he was talking about one of the Amarna letters, and some other king, some Hittite king, and some other king saying to the writing a letter to the pharaoh and saying, gold, it's like dirt in your country, it's everywhere, and this must have been played a huge role in sort of the rise of Egypt to become this sort of regional superpower.
Yeah, Egypt was a major source of gold. I mean, particularly the Eastern Desert and the Nubian Desert is where the Egyptians got their gold from. And in the late Bronze Age, so between about 1500 and 1200 BC, its richness in gold was one of the reasons why a lot of people wanted to have good diplomatic relationships with them. Though, of course, the bloke who's writing to the Egyptian pharaoh saying, in Egypt, gold is as plentiful as dust, is, of course, massively exaggerating. And the point is, please send me more gold. I'm not happy with how much you've sent me. It's a kind of, it's a bit like when you haggle today. If you go, go to the souk and you're, trying to say, well, there's a chip on this teapot, so I'm going to give you less, and all of this kind of thing. I mean, again, nothing changes very much. International relations are very haggly, in my opinion, and this is something that people never seem to stress when they're reading them. They always take them so damn seriously. Sorry, I've done it again. Whereas actually, I think a lot of it you can't read at face value. They're all negotiating ploys.
Yeah. Just to go back to the theology, one sort of enigmatic pharaoh who I don't think we've really talked about, who had a huge, caused a sea change as far as Egyptian theology goes, is Akhenaten, and this sort of transition to monotheism, which is an interesting sort of subject to talk about. Tell us about Akhenaten and what was he thinking?
Yeah, so, I mean, Akhenaten he lived in the 1300s BC, and he didn't have a very long reign. He reigned for 17 years, and in those 17 years, he completely turned Egyptian religion upside down. Now, people often say he was a monotheist, but I actually think that it's actually a bit difficult to say that, because if you look at the evidence from his reign, he was obsessed with one particular god. That's certainly true. This god, which is a relatively new form of the sun god, the Aten. And eventually, he kind of built a city where the Aten alone was the god that he was worshipping. And he even had some of the old traditional gods' temples defaced and had the images of the old gods hacked out. And even, in fact, the plural of the word God is occasionally hacked out. But on the other hand, he also worshipped his deified father, Amenhotep III. And I've always wondered, well, how does that work if there's only one God? And some people have suggested that maybe the god he worshipped was, in fact, his dead dad, become the sun god. Who knows? But all the same, I think if you go to the city, King Akhenaten also founded a new capital city. And it had giant temples to this new god of his, the Aten. But if you actually go and look at the archaeological finds in people's houses in this city, which do survive, there are often little amulets of the old gods. There are even paintings on some walls of the old gods. Now, it's difficult to know whether these were clandestine by people who were worshipping illegally or risking the displeasure of Akhenaten, or whether, in fact, actually Akhenaten just didn't care. There's relatively little evidence that he was a proselytizer. He's really interested in him worshipping the Aten, and he says the Aten has dominion over the whole universe. But there's not so much evidence that he said everyone must agree with him. In fact, in practice, I find it rather difficult to believe that the Egyptian state apparatus was sufficiently well developed that they could have a secret police keeping an eye on what everyone got up to in their homes, really. And of course, the most telling thing is that pretty quickly after he died, within 2 or 3 years, the Egyptians began to row quite quickly backwards and to rehabilitate the old gods. It's fairly clear that this was, not seen as a success, and that almost as soon as he was, curled in his grave, the powers that be decided they needed to change course and tack back. There's Tutankhamun was probably Akhenaten's son and a child. And so it must have been his advisors. But there's an actual inscription of Tutankhamun, the restoration stela, where it describes the bad state of Egypt when he came to the throne. And it says, the temples had been abandoned and their holy places had become public footpaths, which is not a good thing. Normally, you shouldn't be able to wander through the Holy of Holies of a temple. That's a private place for the god. And he actually, he says, if one prayed to a god for help, they would never come at all. And then, of course, the inscription goes on and tells us how Tutankhamun restored everything.
So there's a hint that maybe this didn't work out, maybe from an agricultural point of view.
There's some debate about that. I don't think really there's strong evidence for there, for example, being any problems with the Nile floods or food shortages. I mean, people have suggested this might be going on at this time. I think the evidence is quite ambiguous for that. There is more evidence for epidemic illness. There seems to be some kind of plague which strikes the whole Near East in this period. And it's quite possible that, and in fact, quite a few royal family members seem to succumb to it. So it may be that if there was an epidemic plague of some sort in Egypt late in Akhenaten's reign, this might have been interpreted as the disfavour of the traditional gods. The other possibility is that Akhenaten does not seem to have been a particularly military pharaoh. And so Egypt at this time controlled quite a large empire in Syria-Palestine, reaching up almost as far as the modern-day Turkish-Syrian border, so quite a long way up there. And at this time, it comes under threat by the people in what's now Turkey, the Hittites. So the Hittite king leads a campaign which directly threatens Egyptian control in the northern part of their empire. And although it's not entirely clear what happens, it looks as if Akhenaten was unsuccessful in holding on to it. And so the loss of prestige and political power may also have been another sign that the old gods did not approve of him.
Yeah, and a great opportunity from a PR point of view from the old priesthood to get their way and reinstitute the... Again, I know what you're saying. It's hard to... I was going to say polytheism, but it's sort of debatable whether that was abandoned or not by Akhenaten, whether he just favoured one god to an extreme or whether he was a monotheist or whatever. It's fascinating. I can't believe we've gone over an hour already. I've completely hogged Roland, Matt and Ben. I don't think you've even got one question in yet.
I just enjoyed listening and learning. It's been absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much, Roland, for your time. It's been a great one.
Oh, thanks. It's been enjoyable.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed it. I'm sure people listening have. Matt, is there anything you want to ask Roland before I let him go?
I was just going to ask, really, what's your kind of favourite thing that you've come across when you've been out in Egypt as a graffiti or some kind of script that you found in a quarry?
Well, so I have a dig in Egypt, in an ancient quarry in the desert, a place called Hatnub, and it was where the Egyptians mined alabaster. So that milky white, translucent, veined material, which is actually popular today as a tourist souvenir from Egypt,
right.
And which the ancient Egyptians used a lot for their religious ceremonies. And in this quarry, from 4,000 years ago, the quarrymen actually leave details of their expeditions. So who went there, their life stories, telling us they're good blokes. And since I started work there in 2012, myself and my colleagues from the team, we've identified dozens and dozens of inscriptions that no one had ever realized existed there. And nothing in my career compares to the thrill of finding a text that no one has read for 40 centuries.
Yeah. So any of it then, basically. So how frequent is it that you come across something in the quarry? We've cleared most of the walls now, so I think it's unlikely that we're going to find more because basically we had to clean the walls, we had to remove the rubble on them, and that's how we discovered the inscriptions. But of course we've still got years ahead of us to actually study them, publish them, think about their meaning, and we're still working in only one particularly large quarry in this area. There are others that have inscriptions that we are aware of. So we've got a big program of work ahead of us. Right. Okay.
Excellent. Well, I think we should let Roland go. It's been if
we must.
Yeah, I know. I could go on all night about this stuff, but
okay. Well, thank you for having me.
No problem.
You're welcome.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Just stay on the line for us for 1 minute while we play ourselves out. And we'll catch you on the flip side, eavesdroppers. Don't touch that dial.
Yeah.